In this video, I'll be talking about a few things that many people don't know or don't really talk about when it comes to stocks and shares ISAs. A few interesting points that can cost you a lot of money if you get them wrong. And guess what? Many people do get them wrong. Okay, so the first thing you need to be aware of is that even though you're investing in a stocks and shares ISA, you still have to pay some taxes. But before we get into this, please bear in mind that I am not a tax expert. This information is relevant at the time of the video and rules are subject to change. So you should seek help from a registered financial advisor if you need it, because this video does not constitute financial advice. As you know, a stocks and shares ISA is a type of account that lets you invest up to £20,000 per year completely tax-free. This means that you don't have to pay any capital gains tax or dividend income tax on your investments ever, no matter how much they grow. However, you still have to pay two other types of tax. The first one is stamp duty, which applies to UK shares. So if you buy UK stocks, you will have to pay a 0.5% stamp duty every single time you buy a stock, including inside an ISA. For example, if you buy £1,000 worth of shares in Unilever, you will have to pay £5 in stamp duty. However, it's worth noting that this tax only applies on buying, not on selling stocks, which means that you only pay it once. But the bottom line is that essentially anyone buying shares in a UK company will need to pay stamp duty. But of course, you don't have to pay stamp duty if you buy foreign shares outside the UK in an ISA. Now, this tax is taken automatically when you buy the shares, so you can't do anything about it, but it's worth knowing about. The second type of tax that you still have to pay, despite the fact that you invest in an ISA, is dividend withholding tax. As you know, you don't have to pay any UK dividend tax inside your stocks and shares ISA, but many foreign governments impose withholding tax on dividends before they even reach you. And unfortunately, ISAs don't have any special status for foreign tax. Just because they are a UK tax shelter doesn't mean that foreign governments are going to cut them any extra tax breaks. Therefore, when it comes to withholding tax, foreign stocks in an ISA get treated exactly the same as foreign stocks outside an ISA. So for example, if you're looking to invest in dividend stocks in the US, you will be charged a dividend withholding tax of 30%, although you could get a tax break of 15% due to a tax treaty between the US and the UK. Most of us probably invest in the S&P 500, and a lot of the companies inside the S&P 500 will pay dividends. This means that every time we get our dividends from them, even if it's reinvested, we will lose 15% of those dividends that these companies pay. As with the stamp duty, we have no control over this because this whole taxation process will happen in the background. But it's worth being aware of it, particularly if dividend investing is your main strategy. The next really important point is not to pick a stocks and shares ISA based on their fees alone. Quite often, people comparing ISAs just look at their fees and tend to go for the cheapest one, which makes a lot of sense, right? And there are many investment platforms that offer free ISAs, or very cheap ones, such as InvestEngine or Trading212. However, people often forget that for these companies to be able to do that, there will always be a catch. For example, Trading212 offered a free ISA for a while, but then they introduced a 0.15% foreign exchange fee. Freetrade also increased their fees substantially multiple times since they launched. And again, although not ideal, it makes total sense for these companies to up their prices. In the end, they also need to keep up with inflation. But here is where it gets interesting. Although you can get a great deal from these relatively newer platforms, if they suddenly decide to stop being free and increase their fees to levels that you're not comfortable with, you may want to move to a different provider if you don't want to continue paying those fees. But the trick is that most of these platforms don't let you do what's called an in-specie transfer out. Sometimes they let you transfer in, but not out. An in-specie transfer means moving your shares or index funds to your new stocks and shares ISA provider. If your provider doesn't let you do that and you want to switch to a new one, you would have to sell your investments, pay all the fees for selling, move the money across as cash, and then buy those investments again on the new platform and pay even more fees in the process. So if you do that, you might lose a lot of money in fees. And some of the old school providers in the UK charge insane fees. For example, with Hargreaves Lansdown, you have to pay 0.45% in annual management fees if you invest in shares, and then a separate 0.45% for any funds you hold. You also have to pay £12 every single time you buy a share. So if you want to buy £100 worth of Tesla shares, you have to pay almost 12% in fees to do so, just for that one transaction. And of course, you have to pay 1% in foreign exchange fees when you buy foreign stocks, ETFs on top of all the other fees. And remember that all these fees are not protected by an ISA. So the bottom line is that you need to be aware of the brokers that are free, but don't necessarily go with a broker that is super expensive either. Now, don't get me wrong, these newer platforms are great, and their ISAs are still probably the cheapest on the market for those who invest smaller amounts. But you need to be really careful about their terms and conditions, and any hidden costs that may come with managing your investments within your ISA. I spoke about this in my other video about costly ISA mistakes to avoid, but this next point is so important that I want to reiterate it here. Stocks and shares ISAs are not flexible. Let me explain what I mean with an example. Let's say you have £10,000 in your stocks and shares ISA. You withdraw £5,000 now to cover some unexpected expenses, let's say, and then a month later you put that £5,000 back in. So out of your £20,000 allowance, you've used £10,000, you've then taken out £5,000, leaving you with £5,000 in the ISA, but then you topped up again with that additional £5,000, bringing you back to £10,000. So you should have £10,000 left to use for the year, right? Well, not really, because that extra £5,000 that you topped up your account with will be counted as an additional deposit, meaning that you've deposited a total of £15,000, taking your allowance down to £5,000 for the year. So the main point here is that if you decide to take some money out of your stocks and shares ISA now, and then a few months later you put more money in, this will count towards your allowance. So be very careful in that regard. Now, here's the thing. There are a few providers out there that offer flexible ISAs, whereby you can take out cash and then put it back in during the same tax year without reducing your current year's allowance. Two popular ones that I know of that offer this version are Vanguard and IG. So if you can afford to max out your ISA and want to have this option, look out for those. This actually leads nicely into the next point. As you know, if you have multiple funds in your investment portfolio, over the years, you'll need to rebalance it if you want to maintain those weightings that you've originally set at the beginning. Meaning that you'll have to sell funds which have overperformed and then buy more into the funds that have underperformed. So, for example, let's say you have a stocks and shares ISA with 50% equity ETFs and 50% bond ETFs. If your equity ETFs suddenly rise in value and you sell some for profit, but then you want to reinvest that profit into your bond ETFs to keep your 50-50 balance, will that reinvested profit count towards your ISA allowance if it stays within the ISA account? So the rules say that any gains you make on your investments are not counted as part of your stocks and shares ISA allowance. This means that if you sell any of your shares in your stocks and shares ISA, you can reinvest the proceeds in the ISA and they will not count towards your annual allowance either. However, if you withdraw these profits and then deposit more money later, this will count as a contribution and affect your allowance. And the same applies to dividends. For example, if you have £5,000 in an ISA and you get £500 in dividends, you can choose to reinvest that money tax-free without reducing the allowance for the year. However, if you choose to reinvest those dividends as cash into your bank account and then later on decide you want to add them into your ISA, that will count towards your allowance. So pay close attention to these things and make sure you don't go over your allowance. The next point I want to address is that stocks and shares ISAs should only be used for long-term investing. Although you're encouraged to open a stocks and shares ISA when you start investing, most people forget to mention that if you don't plan on investing for the long term, you probably don't have to use one and pay extra fees. ISAs and investing more generally shouldn't be used for the purposes of covering any short-term expenses, such as saving for a house deposit, for example. The main reason is that since you're using a stocks and shares ISA to invest in the stock market, if you plan to withdraw cash in the next 2 to 3 years, for instance, you are taking on a huge risk that the stock market will be on the rise when you want to take that money out. But the reality is that the market can drop unexpectedly at any given point in time for all kinds of reasons. And if it happens to drop when you want to withdraw the money for your deposit, then you will actually lose more than you would have hoped to make. So the way to treat the stocks and shares ISA is like a retirement account. And if you do open one, do it for the purposes of uninterrupted long-term investing. That means 10 to 30 years. And perhaps consider a lifetime ISA if you want to save for a deposit, or even a cash ISA, because many of them offer really good rates at the moment, completely risk-free. Just before we move on to the next point, if you're enjoying this video and you've made it this far, please do subscribe. It really does help out small UK channels like mine. Thank you. The final point I want to talk about, which is often overlooked, is the fact that you don't actually have to use the Stocks and Shares ISA. This may leave you confused at first, but let me explain. So the reason why I say have to is that you're often encouraged to open a Stocks and Shares ISA when you first start investing and plan to invest large sums of money for the long term. But the reality is that a lot of people don't invest large amounts of money and they will be okay not opening one. We often forget that we have pretty generous tax-free allowances in any given tax year. As it currently stands, each of us has allowances from the government for our own dividend income and capital gains. So if we make money from our shares, either because they paid a nice dividend or because they went up in value and then we sold them to profit from that, we might not have to pay any tax, even if we're not using a Stocks and Shares ISA and we're just using a general investment account that most platforms offer. Now for the tax year 2024-25, the dividend allowance has been reduced to £500, meaning that if your investments generate you up to £500 per year in dividend income, you won't have to pay any tax. You'll only have to pay tax on the money that exceeds that limit. And the capital gains allowance currently stands at £3,000 per year. This is very low compared to previous years when it used to be £12,300 per year, but I still think that it will be fine for a lot of people. Because the reality is that most of the Stocks and Shares ISAs are not free. For example, Freetrade charge $4.99 per month to have a Stocks and Shares ISA with them, whereas their general investment account is free. The point I'm trying to make here is that if you just wanted to play around with small amounts of cash on an investment app to just get used to things, then you don't necessarily need to pay for an ISA. But here's the thing, you can simplify your decision-making process massively by building a portfolio of funds that invest in hundreds of companies from all over the world. So watch this video next to learn about what I think is the perfect Vanguard portfolio that you can hold forever.